Hello class, in this lesson we'll focus on the consonant sounds of the English language. Now, in every language there are two types of speech sounds, consonant sounds and vowel sounds. First of all, we can define consonants as the sounds that are produced with some kind of blockage of the airstream depending on the speech organs that are involved in such a way that they are produced with some kind of obstruction. So, some examples of consonant sounds are found in words like big and map and see, which begin with consonant sounds. On the other hand, vowel sounds are produced without any kind of obstruction from any other speech organs so that the airstream moves almost unobstructed. Some examples are the first sounds in words such as apple or east or over or out. Now it is important to mention that even though every language has consonant and vowel sounds, no single language has exactly the same consonant and vowel sounds than any other language. Now, we can define consonant sounds and classify them according to three major criteria. First of all, the place of articulation, which refers to the speech organs that are involved in the obstruction of the air. The second one is manner of articulation, and this basically refers to the way in which the air is obstructed, totally or partially, and in what manner. The last criterion is voicing, and this involves whether or not there is a vibration of the vocal folds when the consonant sound is produced. To talk about the first criterion, the place of articulation, we will need to refer to this diagram of the articulatory system. So first of all, we will see that we have a nasal cavity that helps us to produce some kind of sounds. There is, of course, the oral cavity, the mouth itself, right? There is, of course, the alveolar ridge, which is placed just behind the teeth. We have the nostril, which is the entrance to the nose, right? The little holes that we have in our noses. And there are the lips, the teeth, the vocal folds on both sides of the glottis, right? There is the glottis itself, which opens and closes to produce some kinds of sounds. There is, of course, the larynx, which is like this tubular structure that helps us to bring the air from the lungs into the mouth to produce sounds. There's the epiglottis, the pharynx, of course, the uvula, the soft palate or velum, the hard palate, or that is just before the soft palate. And finally, very importantly, there is the most important organ for speech, which is the tongue. It has a tip, it has a front, it has a back, and it has a root. So when going to describe consonant sounds, we need to refer to these different places of articulation. That means the organs that are involved in the production of these sounds. So now let's begin with the description of consonant sounds of English depending on the place of articulation. The first place of articulation will be both lips, and we have bilabial sounds. Some examples are p, and as in pet, and b as in bat, and m as in met, and finally w as in wet. So all of these are bilabial sounds because they are produced with both lips. The second place of articulation is the upper teeth and the lower lip. We call these labiodental sounds, and some examples are f as in fan and v as in van. Now let's talk about interdental sounds, which are produced by placing the tongue between the upper and lower teeth. Some examples involve as in the word thin, thin, and also v, as in the word then. So these two are interdental sounds because they are produced with the teeth. Now there are also a great number of alveolar sounds in English. It is important to say here that we can see that these sounds are produced with the tip of the tongue touching the alveolar ridge. Some examples include t, t, as in the word tear. There is also d, d, as in the word deer. There is also n, as in the word near. Another alveolar sound is l, as in Lear, like the King Lear from the Shakespeare play. There is also the sound s, as in Sue. And finally, the sound z, as in zoo. So all of these are alveolar sounds because they are produced with the tip of the tongue touching the alveolar ridge. Now let's talk about palatal sounds, and some of them are called alveopalatal sounds. We can see that these sounds, first of all, are produced with the front of the tongue touching or approaching the hard palate. Some examples are sh, as in the word shoes. There is also zh, as in the word measure, measure. There is ch, ch, as in the word choose. There is j, j, as in the word major, major. There is the sound as in the word rear, right? And finally, there is the sound e, as in the word year. So all of these are palatal sounds because they are produced with the front of the tongue approaching or touching the hard palate. Now let's move on to the velar sounds. We can see here that the parts involved in production of velar sounds are the back of the tongue and the soft palate. Some examples of velar sounds are k, k, as in peck. There is also g, g, as in peg. And there is ng, as in the word peng. So all of these are velar sounds because they are produced with our back of our tongues touching or approaching the soft palate or velum. Now the last point of articulation in English is the glottis, and there is just one glottal sound, which is h, as in the word humble, humble. Okay, so we need to remember all of these places of articulations because they are very important for the description of consonant sounds. Now let's talk about the second criterion for the classification of consonant sounds in English, and it is manner of articulation. So there are different ways in which we can obstruct the R, and this is going to define the kind of sound that is produced. Now in English, there are different types of consonants, such as stops or plosives. There are also fricative sounds, there are affricate sounds, there are nasal sounds, liquid sounds, and finally semivowels. We're going to see how all of these kinds of consonant sounds are produced in a different way, and that's why they have a different manner of articulation. Let's begin with the stops or plosives. Now these sounds, as the name suggests, are produced with a complete obstruction of the airstream. So what happens is that we block the air completely and then we let it go. So these sounds are produced with some kind of explosion. Okay, the air is obstructed, it comes out violently, and that's what they call stops or plosives. So the examples of plosive or stop sounds in English are p, p. We can see that we block the air with our lips and then we let it escape and it produces an explosion. P, p. Another plosive sound is of course b, b, b. It is exactly the same thing, right? But there's an additional vibration of the vocal cords. But we obstruct the air with our lips, then we let it go to produce b. There is also the sound t, t, t. We can see that the air is completely obstructed, you know, in our alveolar ridge and our tip of the tongue, and so it causes an explosion. T. Obviously, there is also d, d, which is exactly the same sound, but with the additional vibration of our vocal cords. Now, finally, we have also the sound k, 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 which is produced again with the obstruction of the back of the tongue and our soft palate, right? Which produces this explosion. K, k, k. And of course, there is also the voiced sound g, 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 which is exactly the same sound as k, but with an additional vibration of our vocal cords. So all of these are stop sounds because they are produced with the obstruction of the air and then the air is released, creating an explosion, which is the characteristic, the defining characteristic of these kind of sounds. Now let's talk about fricative sounds. As the name suggests, these sounds are produced with only a partial obstruction of the airstream, which causes, of course, this continuous flow of the air through a really small opening, which creates a friction. And this friction is the defining characteristic of fricative sounds. So, a difference between stop sounds and fricative sounds is that fricative sounds can be lengthened, they can be just kept for as long as there is air in our lungs. Okay, so with a stop sound, if you remember, there is blocked and then released, p, p, right? But in fricative sounds, the air is only partially blocked. We're going to see how these sounds are produced one by one. Let's talk about then the fricative sounds of English. First of all, we have f, and this sound is produced with our upper teeth and our lower lip, which block the air only partially, so that we can produce this sound, which is like a friction of the air. Listen. And as you can see, we can keep them for a long time because the air is only partially obstructed. This is very different from a plosive sound. So obviously, the sound v, v, v is also a fricative, but with an additional vibration of our vocal cords. Another pair of fricative sounds are s, in which, as we said before, the tip of the tongue approaches the alveolar ridge, but there is an opening. The air can escape, right? And it produces this friction that we can hear as s. Obviously, we also have the sound z, which is the same sound, but with an additional vibration of our vocal cords. Now, another pair of fricative sounds are and we can see again that these sounds are produced with a partial obstruction of the air, which creates this friction, in this case between the tongue and our upper and lower teeth. Now, there are some other fricative sounds. In this case, the sound sh. We can see here that there is also a partial obstruction between our hard palate and the front of our tongues, which creates this friction. Shh. Obviously, the sound sh is also a fricative sound. Finally, the last fricative sound that we have in English, and this can be a little controversial, but the truth is that there is a partial obstruction of the air at the level of our glottis to produce the sound. If you see, when you produce these sounds, you can see how the air is partially blocked with your glottis, and this friction produces the sound. So all of these are the fricative sounds of English. We can see that there is a great number of fricative sounds. Now, another kind of sounds that are very special in English are called affricates. Now, these sounds are complex because they start as stops, but they end as fricatives. So, this combination of stop and fricative is known in English as an affricate phoneme. Now, a shared characteristic with the stop sounds is that an affricate sound cannot be sustained. That means that you release them in just one moment. It's pretty much like a plosive sound. You cannot make it long like a fricative sound. A fricative sounds can be very, very long. We can say shh for a long time, but an affricate sound is produced with one single explosion. For example, ch. Let's look at them in detail. In this diagram, we can see more clearly how the affricate sounds ch, ch, and j, j are produced. First of all, they begin with a little blockage of the air in the alveolar ridge, but then they move back to an opening at the level of the palate. So we have t and sh, which becomes ch, ch, ch. And in the same way, the sound j begins as d, d, and then it becomes j, so that when we pronounce it together, it sounds as j, j. We can see that these sounds cannot be extended. They can only be produced in one single moment. Ch, ch. You see, this sound is like when you sneeze. Ch. And the other sound is exactly the same, but with an additional vibration of the vocal cords. J, j. So these are the two affricate sounds of English. There are only two. Now let's talk about the nasal sounds. Of course, as the name suggests, in this kind of sounds, the air does not go through the mouth, but through the nose. And that's why these are called nasal sounds. The oral cavity is blocked, and there is only an exit through the nose. So something important that we can say is also that these kind of sounds can be sustained, they can be maintained for as long as you have air in your lungs, right? For example, the sound which is a nasal sound, can be you can just sustain it for as long as you have air in your lungs. And of course, something important is you cannot produce them when the nasal cavity is blocked. If you cover your nose with your fingers, by pressing your fingers, you will not be able to produce nasal sounds because the nasal cavity is blocked. Let's look at them. Now, what happens with nasal sounds is that you can see that the tongue is blocking the oral cavity, so the air cannot escape. It has to go up all the way through the nasal cavity, and it comes out in the nostrils. That's why these sounds are called nasal, because they are produced by air that passes through the nasal cavity. Some examples are the sound okay. If you want to see why this sound is nasal, try to just cover your nose, block the air, and you will see that it's impossible. It's actually impossible to produce the sound if you block the air from coming out from your nose. Okay. Another nasal sound is which is also exactly the same. The air comes through the nose, not through the mouth. And finally, the sound is also a nasal sound. You produce it by leading or taking your air out of your nose. Okay, that's why they're called nasal sounds. Now, there are other kind of sounds that are very particular that are called liquids. Okay, we have two kinds of liquid sounds. We have the lateral and the retroflex Now, what happens, and the reason why these sounds are called liquid, is because when we pronounce them, the air passes through the mouth in a very fluid manner. That means that we don't feel any kind of obstruction or any kind of friction, but they just flow very smoothly. Now, what happens in the sound is that the tip of our tongue touches the alveolar ridge, and then the air passes through the mouth over the sides of a tongue. That's why it is called lateral, because the air comes out through the sides of our tongue. On the other hand, what happens with is that we are going to curl our tongue back, approaching or touching the hard palate, and that's the reason why these sounds are called retroflex, because we produce this sound by curling our tongue to the back, like, okay, retroflex. So these two sounds are called liquids, but is lateral and is retroflex. We're going to see here with this diagram the production of the lateral We can see the tip of the tongue is touching the alveolar ridge, and the air goes through the souds, through both sides of the tongue. That's why it's called lateral. This diagram, in contrast, shows the production of the retroflex We can see that the tip of the tongue is approaching or touching the hard palate, which makes it curve back, and this kind of flexion of the tongue is what produces this kind of sound. That's why the sound is called a retroflex. The last kind of consonant sounds in English are called semivowels or glides. And they are called semivowels because they are very similar to vowel sounds. They are produced with a relatively wide opening in the mouth, and of course, this makes them sound pretty much like vowel sounds. An important characteristic of these sounds is that, like vowel sounds, they can be sustained for as long as there is air in the lungs. Now, there are two semivowels in English. The first one is w, which is produced with a rounding of the lips. It's very similar to the vowel u, but it's produced with the lips w. And the second semivowel is e, which is produced with a tongue approaching the hard palate and the lips spreading apart, and it's very similar to the vowel e. But of course, this one is stronger because the tongue approaches the hard palate. It's not like completely open like the vowel e. Okay, so these are the two semivowels in English, w and e, and they are of course very important kind of sounds that need to be pronounced correctly. Now, finally, the third criterion for the classification of consonant sounds in English is voicing, and in this regard, we can say that phonemes that are produced with a vibration of the vocal cords are called voiced sounds. And on the other hand, voiceless sounds are produced with no vibration of the vocal cords. That's what they're called, voiceless. Now, it's very easy to know which sounds are voiced and which ones are voiceless, because we can say that all of the semivowels, all of the liquids, and all of the nasal phonemes are voiced. Okay? And of course, is also voiceless. Now, for the rest of the consonant phonemes, we have both a voiceless and a voiced version. So these sounds actually come in pairs. Now we can see in this little table the different pairs of voiceless and voiced sounds. We can see, for example, p as in put is voiceless, but b as in but is voiced. T as in tin is voiceless, and d as in dive is voiced. K as in cape is voiceless, and g as in gun is voiced. F as in foot is voiceless, but v as in vote is voiced. So all of these pairs of sounds have a voiceless and a voiced version. Now look at the examples and try to practice them. So this is everything that we have to say about the definition and the classification of the consonant sounds in English. Thanks a lot for your attention, and turn to your activity on Classroom.